First, I want to remind you that when in NARM we talk about identifications, we're not talking about just mental representations. That in itself is a profound distinction from what Masterson is talking about. That when I talk about identifications, I'm talking about a psychobiological dynamic. And that with every distortion of identification, there is either constriction or collapse. And with collapse, there's always constriction underneath that collapse. So that I'm sure every one of you has had, in any model, but particularly in the NARM model, when you've had a useful session, almost everybody describes more space opening up, more room. That space, that room that you start to experience, is the direct experience of identifications dissolving. And when identifications, these distortions of our identity, which again are psychobiological, when they start to dissolve, we start to regulate, the body starts to open, all kinds of helpful things and useful things that will start to emerge. So that's the first point. But it's also important to remember that no identification exists outside of an object relation. And I'll define my terms again. In other words, we didn't develop these identifications, this distorted sense of ourself. It's not just ideas; they include ideas, but it's this distorted sense of ourself out of nowhere. So that every identification, ultimately, whether we talk about it or address it directly, we're talking about some kind of object relation. So that, that sense that we're bad is in connection to somebody else. So that we want to keep that in mind, that this is a fundamental element, and that as those of you who've been with me have heard me say over and over again, is that we weren't born with this. We weren't born thinking about ourselves as bad, or thinking of ourselves as defective, or thinking of ourselves as defective, or thinking of that our needs are bad, or that setting limits is bad. Those were things that we learned along the way. Those are part of identifications, object relations, and as you've seen, hopefully, a part of survival styles. So we just want to keep in mind that when even if we're talking about the abstract identification element, it's always in terms of an object relation. And that's very useful because we see then that every identification and the various strategies and symptoms that are associated with that makes sense for a person on a certain level in a relational way. In other words, we develop these identifications so often, as you've seen, as it comes down to in NARM, as a way of protecting the attachment relationship. So no matter how dysfunctional a behavior or an attitude or a belief or whatever seems on the surface, on a deep level, it seems like the best possibility that a person can come up with at the time. And I hope that you can experience the compassion that is in that we don't want. There's been enough pathologizing in our field, and in NARM I've really worked very hard to take away the pathologizing thing, to see that all of these elements are just part of the human experience. Trauma is not a new thing for us human beings. Trauma has been the way of the world for a long, long time. But so we're all in this together in different ways, but of course there are also some people are more connected to what's most real in them, and other people are more disconnected. And those are realities that we work with. And generally, people who have experienced the most early and most profound, and particularly when it's chronic developmental trauma, end up being most disconnected from what's most real in themselves. It was just too dangerous to show up in an authentic way. So we develop the various sense of ourself, which in relationship, and then we see that all of the identifications and object relations that we have that constellate around certain kinds of red threads, and those are the survival styles. We see that there are, that there are some kinds of basic ways. The survival styles are just a way of understanding and organizing our understanding of the way people have adapted to different kinds of environmental failure in their life. It isn't to exclude that, of course, there's genetic and constitutional and biological differences between people, but at the same time, so much of where we struggle has to do with these adaptations that we've made. And the survival styles help us understand the patterns of the various object relations and identifications in a clearer way. It gives us clearer tools sometimes. But we don't use the survival styles to diagnose. In other words, we don't say, okay, well, this person's an autonomy structure, so then here's my treatment plan. It's more that it helps us, it informs us to ask more questions that are more to the point, that might have a higher degree of likelihood of being useful to the person in the form of inquiry, the somatically based inquiry that we do at NARM. And so then, to my final point about that is that it's the persistence of survival styles that distorts present experience, that creates the symptoms and the difficulties that we experience. It's not what happened. It's not that what happened in the past is irrelevant, because of course it's not irrelevant, but it's the adaptations that we made that have to do with various kinds of distortions and disconnections that we carry forward in our lives and then act out in our work life, in our love life, in our relationship life, in the world. It's the persistence of these dynamics that creates the difficulties that we have. And in that, you see, that's where the piece of agency is. Agency isn't blaming anybody. Blaming yourself is the opposite of agency, but seeing what we're doing to ourselves, how we've carried forward whatever adaptation to the environmental failure that we've experienced, and what we're doing with that as adults. And it's really a fundamental shift.